These were much happier times for Omar Khadr. It's been nearly 8 years since the Toronto native has seen his family. Growing up as a kid, Omar was described by his teachers being a smart, eager and polite child. He spent much of his childhood travelling between Canada and Pakistan. However, it was in 2002 at the age of 15 that the young Canadian's ordeal began. Omar was captured by American forces following an intense shootout, during which he was accused of allegedly throwing the grenade that killed Sergeant First Class Christopher James Spear. Shortly after his capture, Omar was transferred to the notorious detention center in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where he has been subjected to treatment in violation of the Convention Against Torture.
He was subjected to what was known as the frequent flyer program, which is a system of systematic sleep deprivation, and it's an interrogation tactic that's used to decrease resistance to questioning, and has been a tactic that's been found by international courts to violate the Convention Against Torture. The BCCLA is obviously opposed to the use of torture. The prohibition against torture is absolute, it's universal, it's enshrined in both domestic Canadian law and international law. There is, from a legal perspective, there is never a situation where torture is permissible. And so for the Americans to have engaged in it is entirely impermissible. And for Canada to abandon one of its citizens to torture is also, in our view, entirely impermissible.
Yet in spite of this, Omar has spent the last 7 years locked up in Guantanamo, due in large part because of the Canadian government's staunch refusal to seek his repatriation. Other governments like the British and French have successfully secured the repatriation of their own citizens. Yet Omar still remains the only Western citizen still detained at Guantanamo. Across the country, Canadians have asked the government to repatriate Omar. High-profile figures like Senator Romeo Dallaire have asked the government to bring Omar home. Moreover, the foundations on which Guantanamo has stood have been called into question by human rights organizations and governments around the world. Perhaps most importantly, U.S. courts, like the U.S. Supreme Court, have over the recent years found the U.S. government in error and have awarded Guantanamo detainees like Omar rights previously denied to them. Likewise, Canadian courts have found the Canadian government in error in its position to Omar as well.
One of the things that Canada did when Mr. Khadr was first sent to Guantanamo was to send its agents to assist in the interrogation of him. And what the Canadian courts have found is that because these interrogations took place during a time when Canada was fully aware that the U.S. was engaging in this frequent flyer sleep deprivation program, and during a time when the legislation authorizing the Guantanamo regime was actually unconstitutional in the U.S. itself, the Canadian courts found that Canada's participation in this process violated Mr. Khadr's Section 7 rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And and so when the trial court made this ruling, it also said that the only remedy that would be appropriate was for the federal government to seek Mr. Khadr's repatriation. The federal government appealed that ruling, and it ended up in the Supreme Court. The BCCLA took part in that case. We were interveners, and there we again noted that the Canadian government had committed violations of Mr. Khadr's charter rights, and as a result, the appropriate remedy would be for the federal government to seek his repatriation without delay. The Supreme Court of Canada ultimately ruled that yes, Mr. Khadr's Section 7 rights were violated as a result of what Canadian agents did and their involvement in his interrogation. And please write to your MPs. Please tell them that this is the way that the government has chosen to respond to the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling that his behavior in an unconstitutional fashion is completely unacceptable, and that the charter violations demand actual remedies, and the remedy in this case is to seek his repatriation.